The mountain was quiet that night, save for the restless whispers of the wind threading through skeletal pines. Deep in a narrow hollow, a lone cabin hunched beneath the cliffs, its windows like dark eyes staring into the void. The villagers had long avoided the place, muttering of curses and old bloodlines, but none dared approach, not until the rumors began. She was with child, the woman with hollow cheeks and eyes too bright for a girl born of these mountains. As the moon swelled behind ragged clouds, strange things began to stir, shadows that darted between the trees, distant cries that were half human, half something else, and a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to rise from the soil itself. The midwife had warned them once, her voice brittle with age, saying the mountain does not yield ordinary children, and that the forest keeps its secrets tightly, feeding them only in darkness. That night, thunder shook the ridges and rain lashed the earth like knives, sealing the cabin from the world outside. When the screams began, the wind carried them over the hollow in unnatural echoes, twisting into voices that spoke not from the woman, but from the child she bore, a son with two heads, staring with twin eyes that saw deeper than anyone dared. From the moment his first cry split the storm, the forest leaned closer, listening. The villagers would speak of those nights for decades, whispering about the way he moved, how his voices carried across the hollows, calling names no living soul should ever hear. Some said the mountain had claimed him, others that he was a curse made flesh, yet all agreed on one thing, that in those woods, nothing born there was ever meant to be ordinary. The pregnancy had been a quiet thing at first, barely noticeable under the simple homespun dresses she wore as she moved through the forest paths, tending her small garden and the few chickens she kept. Yet there was something in the way the mountain seemed to lean closer when she walked, as if the trees themselves bent to watch her passage, and the air carried a subtle tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. The villagers had always been wary of her family, who lived at the edge of the hollows where sunlight struggled to touch the mossy ground, and now whispers began to creep through the town like smoke from a dying fire. Some said the child was cursed even before it was born, that the child's soul was not entirely human, and that the woman carried something forbidden, something the old laws of the mountains forbade. She, however, paid little heed to the rumors, tending to her chores and following the rhythms of the forest, though a chill often ran down her spine as night approached, and shadows seemed to gather in corners of the cabin where no light reached. Friends and relatives noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Her eyes darkened, reflecting more than ordinary thought, and sometimes she would stop mid-step, listening as if voices called from the thicket. The animals she kept became restless, chickens shrieking at nothing, dogs growling at the unseen, and even the wind through the hollows carried an uneasy whisper. Midwives in the town had begun to speak of her in hushed tones, recalling old tales of women whose children were born with unnatural signs, those who carried the weight of the forest's old secrets in their wombs. Some said that the child would bear the imprint of the mountain's own mysteries, that the bloodline she carried was touched by forces older than the settlers' cabins, and that the forest itself was waiting for the hour when it would reveal what it had kept hidden. As the months passed, the woman could feel an unsettling presence within her, as though the child shifted in ways beyond ordinary movement, and sometimes, in the silence of the night, she thought she heard a soft murmur inside her, a voice that was not her own. Fear and fascination coiled together among the villagers, who began to leave offerings at the edges of the forest, crossing themselves when passing the cabin, praying the child would be ordinary, praying that the mountain's shadows would not creep into the very life growing within her. But the signs were subtle and insistent, the way the wind circled the hollow, the way the birds scattered in sudden flocks, and the odd, almost human cry that seemed to rise from the soil beneath the cabin. Every day brought a mounting sense of inevitability, a knowledge that this pregnancy was unlike any other, that the woman carried not only a child but something that the mountain itself had claimed long before the settlers ever arrived, and that the forest waited patiently for the moment when the child would emerge into a world already trembling in anticipation. As her belly swelled with the child, the world around the woman began to feel different, as though the forest itself had shifted its boundaries and taken on a consciousness that had nothing to do with ordinary life. The trees whispered in voices that carried through the hollows, and their branches seemed to stretch toward the cabin, brushing against the roof like skeletal fingers. Shadows moved with a will of their own, slipping across the floorboards at night, lingering in corners where no light should reach. At first, the villagers dismissed these occurrences as the imagination of an isolated woman, but the signs soon became impossible to ignore. Travelers passing the old paths reported hearing laughter or sobs in the trees when no one else was near, and the wind often seemed to carry words, soft, unintelligible phrases that made the skin crawl and the hair stand on end. The woman herself felt the presence constantly, a gnawing, unseen weight pressing against her senses, as if something were watching her from just beyond the edges of the firelight. Doors that had been securely latched would creak open on their own, and objects would shift places without explanation. Her animals, once calm and routine-bound, began acting erratically, refusing to enter the barn, barking or hissing at empty spaces, and sometimes disappearing only to reappear hours later with a frantic look in their eyes, as if they had seen something too dreadful to name. On certain nights, when the moon was obscured by clouds and the wind carried low through the hollows, distant cries would rise from the forest, half human, half animal, a sound that made the blood thicken and the air feel heavy with dread. Friends and neighbors whispered that the child within her was not like other children, that it was tied to the spirit of the woods, and that the mountains themselves were murmuring secrets they had not revealed in generations. Even the midwife, grizzled and steeped in her own knowledge of the old ways, would sometimes pause mid-sentence, her face paling, her eyes following some unseen motion, muttering that the forest had awakened and that they were now part of something older than the settlers, older than the cabins, older than the roads that wound between the ridges. Candles flickered in unnatural patterns at night, cold drafts wound their way through the cabin, and the very soil around the house seemed restless, shifting beneath the roots of the trees, carrying with it a sense of anticipation and menace. Each day brought new signs, subtle but insistent, that the forest was alive in ways the villagers could not name, and that the life growing within her carried a resonance with that strange vitality, a pulse in rhythm with the hidden heart of the Appalachian wilderness, stirring the shadows, calling forth voices in the dark that would not be silenced. The midwife was an old woman with skin like parchment and eyes that had seen too many secrets of the hollows, a woman who moved quietly through the shadows of the village and knew things most folk refused even to whisper aloud. She had been summoned when the woman's labor pains began subtly, long before anyone could guess the true nature of the child she carried, and her presence brought a strange weight to the cabin, as though the air itself acknowledged the old woman's understanding of things beyond ordinary comprehension. Sitting across from the expectant mother, the midwife's fingers twisted a worn shawl, her gaze fixed on the swelling belly as though she could see more than flesh and bone beneath the surface. "The mountain does not bear ordinary souls," she said in a voice low and tremulous, carrying the cadence of countless winters spent in the shadowed forests. Her words were not merely caution, but prophecy, an utterance that seemed to make the very walls of the cabin shiver. She spoke of old tales, of children born in hollows where the mist never lifted and the sunlight dared not linger, children who carried the voices of the woods in their bones, and whose presence brought unease to men and animals alike. She told the woman that the forest itself was watching, that the trees held memories of the ancient bloodlines, and that whatever stirred within her womb was tied to forces that could not be bargained with or ignored. The expectant mother listened, heart pounding, feeling the midwife's words settle like stones in her chest. She tried to speak, to argue, to dismiss the fears as old superstition, but the midwife's eyes bore into hers with the unflinching weight of certainty, and for the first time, the woman felt the icy touch of dread. "Mark my words," the midwife whispered, leaning close so that the candlelight danced across her wrinkled face, "this child will walk between worlds, and the voices you may hear are only the beginning. Guard yourself, guard the forest, and pray that you are strong enough to bear what is coming." Even as she spoke, the wind outside seemed to respond, rattling the shutters and making the cabin creak with the sound of unseen footsteps. The midwife stayed late into the evening, murmuring charms under her breath, scattering salt and roots across the threshold, performing rituals born from a knowledge older than the settlements themselves. She lingered by the bed when the woman drifted into uneasy sleep, her gaze toward the hollow beyond the cabin, as though she could see shadows moving through the trees where no one else could. When she finally left, the midwife pressed a hand to the woman's shoulder, cold and firm, and repeated, "The mountain has claimed this child, and the forest will not let it go. Remember, the voices in the dark are listening. They have already begun." The cabin settled into a silence that was anything but ordinary, as though the walls themselves held their breath, and the woman knew that the warning was not merely for caution, but a foretelling of the unnatural birth that would change the hollows forever. The night the labor began, the mountains themselves seemed to awaken in fury, the sky blackened with storm clouds so heavy they pressed down on the hollows like a living thing. Thunder rolled across the ridges, low and rumbling at first, then crashing with such force that the cabin shuddered on its foundations, as though the mountain sought to claim it outright. Rain lashed against the roof and walls, each drop striking like a hammer, and the wind howled through the gaps in the logs with a voice that seemed to echo not only through the forest but through the bones of those who listened. Outside, branches bent and snapped, flying through the air like spears, and the trees groaned under the weight of the storm, their roots clawing at the earth as if resisting some unseen hand. The woman's labor pains came in rhythm with the thunder, each contraction driving waves of fear and anticipation through her body, and she could feel the child within moving in ways that were not entirely human, twisting and turning with an almost sentient awareness of the tempest around them. The midwife moved quietly, her eyes reflecting candlelight and lightning flashes alike, murmuring words of protection and guidance while the storm battered the cabin, aware that this birth was unlike any she had seen in decades. Shadows danced along the walls, elongated and distorted by the flickering flames, and the woman swore she saw shapes outside the windows, moving beneath the sheets of rain, watching with eyes that belonged to neither human nor animal. The animals in the cabin, her few chickens and a restless dog, hid in corners, trembling, and even the fire seemed reluctant to burn, sputtering and struggling against the dampness in the air, as if the storm itself had claimed authority over the world inside the cabin. At times, the sound of the wind and the rain combined with distant, unidentifiable cries, creating a chorus that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, as though the mountain were singing a song of warning and mourning at the same time. Each clap of thunder seemed to mark a moment in the unfolding drama, a reminder that the forces gathered outside were mirrored by the unnatural life stirring within her womb. Time stretched, elongated by fear and anticipation, until the entire hollow seemed to vibrate with the storm's intensity. The midwife whispered urgently, urging the woman to push, to meet the child that had been promised by so many omens, and yet the storm refused to relent, as if it sought to intervene, to dictate the terms of the birth. And through it all, the woman felt the unshakable certainty that this night, drenched in lightning and drenched in rain, was the hinge upon which the fate of the mountain and all who lived near it would turn, and that the child she was about to bear would be remembered long after the storm had passed. The birth came with a violence that matched the storm outside, a cacophony of cries and thunder that shook the cabin to its very beams. The woman's body tensed and convulsed, every nerve alight with pain and a strange, urgent awareness that this child was unlike any other. The midwife knelt beside her, murmuring prayers and charms, her gnarled hands steady despite the chaos, her eyes wide as candlelight flickered across her face, catching in the wrinkles and the unspoken terror she bore. And then, with a final, shuddering push, the child emerged, wet and screaming, and the room fell into a silence so sudden it was nearly worse than the storm. Only, the silence was deceptive, broken by a second cry, distinct and impossibly separate from the first, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere other than the infant's body, yet entirely of it. The woman gasped, clutching her newborn, and then saw it, two heads, fully formed and distinct, each with its own eyes, its own expressions, both looking outward as if they were already aware of the world in ways no newborn should be. One head turned slowly, blinking at the midwife with a gaze that was measured, intelligent, unnervingly calm, while the other head twisted and whimpered, its cries sharp, urgent, demanding, like a voice not entirely belonging to the infant. The midwife let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a prayer, and knelt, studying the child with a mixture of awe and dread, muttering that she had heard of such births only in old tales, spoken of in hushed tones by those who feared the forest and its secrets. The woman clutched the child to her chest, rocking it instinctively, feeling the weight of something unnatural pressing against her heart, a mixture of love and a terror she could not name. Even the storm seemed to pause, the wind rattling against the logs in irregular bursts, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath, watching the new life that had been thrust into the world. The child's heads moved independently, their cries overlapping in ways that made the walls tremble, and for a fleeting moment, the woman felt the presence of the mountain in her cabin, sensing the whispers of leaves and soil, the slow hum of hidden things that had long slumbered in the hollows outside. The forest seemed to lean closer, the rain slashing past the windows in sheets, and the wind carried voices that were not hers nor the midwife's, as though the woods themselves were speaking to the newborn. Each heartbeat in the room echoed with a rhythm that was both familiar and alien, and the woman understood immediately, with a gut-deep certainty, that the child she held carried not only her blood but the pulse of the mountain, a life divided and doubled, bound to the forest in ways that would ripple outward into the hollows, into the village, and into every shadowed path where the whispers had begun long before she ever conceived. The child was barely days old when the first signs of something unnatural began to surface, subtle at first but impossible to ignore. One head would cry while the other remained silent, watching the room with an unsettling focus, tracking the movements of the midwife and the mother as if already discerning truth from falsehood. At night, when the candlelight flickered against the walls, the child's eyes seemed to gleam with an intelligence far beyond his age, and whispers that did not belong to human speech rose from his small frame, carried on breaths too deliberate to be accidental. The mother felt it in the marrow of her bones, a creeping dread that wrapped around her heart and refused to loosen its grip, as though the very cabin had become a vessel for something older, something patient and calculating. Animals reacted before anyone could. Chickens shrieked and scattered at the child's cry, the family dog growled at empty corners and refused to enter rooms where the infant lay, and even the fire seemed to sputter and hiss as though fearful of the small presence that radiated unnatural energy. Sometimes the child would stop crying mid-wail and grin, a slow, knowing curl of the lips that was neither innocent nor childlike, and a shiver would run through anyone near him, leaving them with the sensation that unseen eyes were watching from the shadows beyond the hearth. The midwife, her hands trembling with the weight of her knowledge, began to murmur more fervent warnings, reminding the mother that the child was touched by the mountain's own darkness, and that its voice, those twin voices, were more than cries for food or comfort, they were the echoes of something lurking beyond the edge of human perception. At times, the two heads would argue, speaking in tones that were discordant yet intelligible, uttering threats and demands that the mother could not comprehend fully but understood enough to recognize their danger. A stray gust of wind would carry their murmurs out into the hollows, and neighbors began to report hearing strange sounds in the woods, cries calling names that were not their own, like an invitation or a warning from the child's presence. The family could not leave him unattended, objects would shift around the cabin, mirrors fell inexplicably, and the floorboards creaked under weight that seemed to belong to no one. The mother, once filled with joy at her child's arrival, now recoiled at the sight of his two faces, knowing that each glance carried judgment and awareness that she could not hope to match. Nights were the worst, the air thick with tension, and the shadows from the fireplace danced with malevolence, stretching toward the child in silent obeisance. Slowly, the realization settled into her mind like stone: this was no ordinary child, no fragile infant needing care and love. The boy, with his twin heads and whispered voices, carried a force beyond human reckoning, a presence that could bend the very woods to its will, and the first seeds of fear that he was capable of unthinkable acts had begun to take root in her soul, leaving her restless and haunted even when the sun finally pierced the hollows. Word of the child spread through the hollows like wildfire, carried first by uneasy whispers at the market and later by villagers who dared not speak aloud, their voices trembling with fear. Mothers pulled their children close and hushed their husbands when the name of the woman and her twin-headed son was mentioned, as though even acknowledgement might summon the unnatural presence into their own homes. Travelers passing near the cabin reported glimpses of a small figure at the windows, two faces peering from behind tattered curtains, eyes that seemed to measure the very souls of those who dared approach. The forest around the home seemed to respond to the growing unease, branches scratching at the roof and doors in tandem with the anxious beats of the villagers' hearts, and the winds carried cries and whispers so faint that only those willing to listen closely could catch them. The family found themselves increasingly isolated, not by choice but by the palpable terror of those who once offered neighborly help. Children would scream at the mere mention of the house, dogs refused to pass nearby, and even the few folk who had once called the woman friend began to cross the valley to avoid her path. The mother felt the weight of suspicion pressing upon her chest, heavier than any labor she had endured, and she began to understand that her child's presence was not merely unusual but threatening in a way the mountain seemed to sanction. The midwife, visiting less frequently now, spoke in hushed tones about the danger of curiosity, warning that the villagers' fear could become as destructive as the child itself, that the whispers carried on the wind were not only a warning but an omen, and that the isolation was both protective and inevitable. Strange occurrences only fueled the hysteria. Doors swung open on calm nights, shadows darted across paths where no light shone, and cries, sometimes human, sometimes unplaceable, echoed in the hollows at dusk. The villagers' imagination, already steeped in old superstitions, painted the boy as a harbinger of calamity, a curse from the mountain itself. Yet the family, trapped between their love for the child and the unrelenting suspicion surrounding them, could not leave the forested hollow where they had lived for generations, nor could they ignore the growing sense that the land itself had become complicit, feeding the isolation and feeding the fear. Even the woman's own family began to hesitate at visits, their faces pale with worry, their eyes darting toward the cabin as though expecting shadows to leap from the eaves. Every footstep along the path, every distant whistle in the night, every snap of a branch became a reminder that they were cut off, watched, and feared, and that the child, this twin-headed boy with voices not entirely his own, was at the center of a darkness that had already begun to stretch outward, ensnaring the community in a grip that neither kindness nor reason could break. As the days bled into nights, the voices began, first faint and almost imperceptible, carrying across the hollow like a breeze threaded with malice. At first, the mother thought them imagined, the product of worry and sleepless nights, but the whispers grew sharper, more insistent, curling around the edges of the cabin and slipping through the cracks in the walls. They spoke in tones that were neither male nor female, young nor old, and yet somehow familiar, calling names that had long been buried in memory, murmuring secrets that no one should know, secrets only the mountain itself could have carried. Sometimes the voices spoke from the child, overlapping with his cries, echoing one head against the other, creating a dissonance that pricked at the nerves like cold needles. Shadows shifted in unnatural patterns, bending toward the sound, and the wind seemed to carry an intelligence of its own, parting the trees just so, sending leaves skittering along the forest floor in strange, deliberate paths. The mother, holding the child close, felt a presence pressing on her from all sides, as if the very air was alive with observation, listening, waiting. Neighbors, who had once murmured in fear, began to see shapes moving at the edge of the woods, human-shaped but wrong, twisted, always receding when approached, their whispers joining the chorus that rose from the hollow each night. Dogs howled in unison, chickens scattered violently in the yard, and even the midwife admitted, in the safety of her own home, that she had never encountered anything like this, that the voices were not simply supernatural, but the deliberate communication of something ancient and patient. The child's two heads seemed to respond independently to the sounds, one turning toward the whispers with wide, unblinking eyes, the other grimacing or frowning as though in argument, and the mother began to understand that the voices were teaching, guiding, perhaps even commanding. Sleep became impossible, dreams were invaded by words in the dark, filled with visions of tangled forests, shadowed paths, and eyes glowing just beyond reach. On some nights, the wind carried laughter, low and mocking, rippling across the cabin and up into the hollows, mingling with the child's cries until even the midwife would pause outside the door, hand to mouth, listening in horrified fascination. It was no longer a question of mere fright, the voices in the dark were a force in themselves, shaping the hollow, bending the world to some unknown will, and the mother knew that they were inextricably linked to the child she bore, to his twin heads and their murmured languages, and that every night they whispered closer, closer to the edges of reason and human understanding, until the entire hollow seemed alive with anticipation and dread, the forest itself humming in the strange, impossible rhythm of the boy's presence. The choice before the family was as heavy and immovable as the mountains themselves, pressing down with the weight of inevitability and fear. The villagers had begun to talk openly, no longer content with whispers, their eyes filled with suspicion and dread, and their steps avoiding the hollow where the woman and her twin-headed child lived. Every day brought new signs of the child's unnatural nature, objects shifting inexplicably, shadows moving with intent, and the constant chorus of voices in the dark that seemed to seep from the child and into the forest beyond. The midwife, who had once offered guidance and protective charms, now lingered at the edges, shaking her head in grave concern, warning that the family could not hope to contain what had been born. The mother felt torn between the fierce, instinctual love she bore for her child and the gnawing awareness that this love alone could not shield them from the force that stirred within him. Each time she looked into the two faces, she saw the split consciousness, the intelligence, the awareness, and it was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a duality that seemed to hold the mountain's own secret knowledge in its gaze. Nights were the worst, when the wind carried whispers through the hollow like hungry mouths, when the forest itself seemed to lean close, listening, waiting, and the cries of the child rang out, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, echoing off the ridges in a way that made even the strongest villagers shudder. The father, silent and brooding, spoke rarely, yet his eyes revealed the same understanding. To keep the child in the hollow meant living in constant fear, suspicion, and isolation, yet to abandon or confront him might invite consequences beyond comprehension, stretching outward like roots into every corner of the forested mountains. Discussions became urgent, broken by sobs, murmured prayers, and frantic pacing, the air thick with dread and the scent of damp earth and smoke from the hearth. The family understood that they were entwined with something larger than themselves, that the child carried a force older than settlement and law, older than the cabins or the village paths. The question was no longer simple: hide him and risk the voices, the shadows, and the forest's own will growing unchecked, or face him, confront the unknown, and accept that the hollow's secrets might spill over into their lives in ways unimagined. The wind howled outside as if echoing their indecision, rattling the shutters and shaking the cabin as though impatient, and the child's twin heads watched, silent yet knowing, their eyes reflecting understanding beyond human reckoning. Each heartbeat in the room seemed to sync with the weight of the choice, the trembling of the walls, and the whispering of the forest, until the family realized with a clarity that was as horrifying as it was unavoidable that the decision they made now would shape the fate of the hollow, of themselves, and of every shadow that stirred in the mountains, and that there was no path forward free of consequence.